Beloved, understand this truth. Your house is more than a building. It is a spiritual territory. It is a gate through which blessings can enter or battles can arise. Many people pray, yet ignore the atmosphere where they sleep, eat, and speak. But tonight, light is coming to your understanding. God is about to move, not because of salt alone, but because faith is about to rise. When divine principles meet intentional prayer, heaven responds. Understand this deeply. Salt is not ordinary in the language of the Spirit. From ancient times, salt has represented covenant, permanence, and divine endorsement. When something was sealed with salt, it was meant to last. It meant corruption was not permitted to touch it. This is why the revelation of salt is powerful. Not because of the substance itself, but because of what it signifies in the realm of faith. A covenant is not an emotional agreement. It is a binding spiritual transaction. When God enters covenant with a person, he commits his integrity, his power, and his reputation to that relationship. Salt, therefore, becomes a reminder that what God has spoken concerning you and your household is not fragile. It is preserved, it is defended, it is sustained by divine authority. When decay tries to set in, salt resists it. When corruption attempts to spread, salt confronts it. When time threatens to weaken something valuable, salt preserves its essence. Many people experience repeated cycles of loss, instability, or breakdown without understanding that something precious is being attacked by spiritual decay. Salt reveals that God is not only interested in blessing you, but in preserving what he has already given you. Blessings without preservation eventually become testimonies of regret. But when preservation is activated, what God gives remains intact. Relationships endure, peace remains, progress continues. Salt also represents purity. In the spirit, purity is not merely moral correctness. It is clarity of alignment. When something is pure, it functions according to its original design. Salt purifies by separating what should not coexist. This is why in the realm of prayer, salt becomes a prophetic statement. Anything in my environment that does not align with God's intent is not permitted to remain. It is not aggression, it is alignment. It is not superstition, it is consciousness. There is also authority in covenant symbols. Authority does not come from volume or emotions. It comes from understanding. When you engage covenant symbols with revelation, you are not begging God to act. You are positioning yourself within what he has already established. Salt reminds you that God is not improvising your destiny. He has already spoken. He has already agreed. He has already committed himself to your preservation. Another dimension of salt is separation. Salt distinguishes. It marks boundaries. In ancient covenants, salt signified that certain things were set apart and untouchable. In the same way, when you understand covenant symbolism, you begin to declare with confidence, this home is not common. This family is not ordinary. This destiny is not available for manipulation. Separation is not isolation. It is protection with purpose. Salt also teaches consistency. It works quietly, steadily, without noise. Preservation does not announce itself. It reveals itself over time. This is how God often works. While others are collapsing, you remain standing. While others are confused, clarity guards you. While systems fail, grace sustains you. Not because you are better, but because covenant preservation is at work. Salt calls you to responsibility. Covenant is mutual. God preserves, but you must honor what he preserves. You do not treat lightly what God has sealed. You guard your words, your atmosphere, your values, and your faith. When salt is present, negligence is no longer an option. You become a steward, not just a recipient. This is why understanding salt as a covenant symbol is crucial. It shifts you from fear to confidence, from ritual to revelation, from anxiety to assurance. When preservation is activated, decay loses permission. And when God seals something, no force has the authority to undo it. Spiritual atmospheres are real, and they are constantly shaping outcomes, even when people are unaware of them. Nothing exists in isolation. Every environment carries an influence, and every influence produces a result. This is why two people can do the same thing with the same effort, yet experience different outcomes. The difference is often not skill, intelligence, or desire. It is atmosphere. Atmospheres are invisible, but their effects are visible. Peace, confusion, favor, resistance, joy, heaviness, all these are expressions of spiritual climates at work. Your home, especially, is a spiritual ecosystem. It absorbs words, emotions, conflicts, prayers, and decisions. Over time, these elements accumulate and form an atmosphere. When the atmosphere is healthy, progress feels natural, rest comes easily, relationships flourish. But when the atmosphere is polluted, even simple tasks become exhausting. Sleep is disturbed, communication breaks down, motivation fades. This is not coincidence, it is influence. Many believers pray earnestly but fail to manage their environments. Prayer without atmosphere awareness often leads to frustration. You may pray for peace yet tolerate strife. You may ask for clarity yet allow confusion through unchecked media, words, and attitudes. God responds to prayer, but atmospheres determine how long answers remain. What God releases in a moment can be resisted over time by an unmanaged environment. Influencing an atmosphere does not mean fighting imaginary enemies. It means taking responsibility for what is permitted to stay. Spiritual authority begins with discernment. You must recognize when something feels off, heavy, or draining. Not everything is psychological or circumstantial. Sometimes the atmosphere is simply wrong. And atmospheres do not change by wishing. They change by intentional alignment. Faith is not passive. Faith acts, speaks, and enforces truth. When you pray, you are not merely asking God to visit your space. You are inviting His order to replace disorder. Light does not negotiate with darkness. When light appears, darkness leaves. In the same way, when divine presence is consistently acknowledged, negative atmospheres lose strength. Consistency is key. One moment of prayer can spark change, but sustained atmosphere transformation requires discipline. What you listen to matters. What you say repeatedly matters. How you respond to pressure matters. Atmospheres are shaped daily, not occasionally. This is why spiritual maturity is reflected not only in powerful prayers, but in stable environments. Words are one of the strongest atmosphere shapers. Spoken words carry authority. Complaints, fear, and bitterness deposit weight into the atmosphere. Gratitude, worship, and faith release lightness and peace. Over time, these deposits determine whether your home feels safe or tense, energized or draining. You cannot speak chaos and expect order to remain. Atmospheres also respond to awareness. When you become conscious of spiritual climates, you stop being a victim of them. You stop normalizing heaviness. You stop excusing constant tension. You recognize that peace is not a luxury, it is a spiritual requirement. God's presence thrives where peace is honored. Changing an atmosphere is not about perfection, it is about direction. You may not get everything right, but intentional alignment matters. When God sees hunger for order, He supplies grace for transformation. Small adjustments produce lasting shifts. A prayerful environment invites divine activity. Even when challenges persist, atmospheres either amplify or mute what God is doing in your life. Favor can be released, but atmosphere determines manifestation. Healing can be available, but atmosphere influences reception. When your environment aligns with heaven, progress becomes less forced and more natural. This is why spiritual atmospheres must be influenced deliberately. You are not helpless. You are a steward. When you take responsibility for your environment, you create a space where God's movement is not resisted, but welcomed. And when the atmosphere changes, everything connected to it begins to respond. Physical actions have always played a role in strengthening spiritual awareness, not because power resides in the action itself, but because human beings are designed to engage both the seen and the unseen. Faith is spiritual, yet it is expressed through the body. This is why prayer involves posture, words, movement, and intention. When the heart believes, the body often follows to give expression to that belief. These actions do not create power. They align the believer's consciousness with what God is already doing. Many people misunderstand physical acts in spiritual matters, assuming they replace faith or manipulate outcomes. This misunderstanding leads either to superstition or to rejection. The truth is balanced. God does not need objects to act, but humans often need points of contact to focus faith. These points of contact help the mind and spirit agree. When agreement is established, confidence increases, and faith becomes intentional rather than abstract. Throughout Scripture, physical actions often accompanied spiritual encounters. People lifted their hands, built altars, anointed doors, spoke aloud, and followed specific instructions. None of these actions were magical. They were expressions of obedience. Obedience sharpens spiritual sensitivity. When a person obeys with understanding, the heart becomes receptive and discernment increases. Faith grows clearer when it is acted upon deliberately. A physical action becomes powerful when it is done with revelation. Revelation brings meaning. Meaning brings authority. Without revelation, actions become empty routines. With revelation, even simple acts become reminders of divine truth. They reinforce alignment. They anchor the heart in confidence. This is why intention matters more than the act itself. God responds to faith, not motion. Another important dimension is discipline. Faith that is never expressed becomes theoretical. Physical acts introduce structure into spiritual life. They slow you down, cause reflection, and invite intentional prayer. In a fast-paced world, these moments of deliberate action create space for awareness. Awareness deepens connection. When you pause to act with purpose, you also pause to listen, to reflect, and to realign. Physical actions also help break passivity. Many people desire change but remain inactive, waiting for feelings or signs. Faith often begins with movement. Not movement driven by emotion, but movement rooted in trust. When you act in faith, you remind yourself that you believe God is involved. This shift from passivity to participation changes your posture from helplessness to expectancy. There is also a psychological dimension that supports spiritual engagement. The mind responds to symbols and actions. When you connect belief with action, the mind releases focus, reduces doubt, and reinforces conviction. This does not replace spiritual power, it supports it. God designed the human experience holistically. Spiritual truth often becomes clearer when expressed through tangible steps. However, it must be emphasized that actions without prayer are incomplete. The power is never in the act. It is in the God who responds to faith. Actions are doors, not destinations. They direct attention toward God, not toward the act itself. When people begin to trust actions more than God, alignment is lost. But when actions point back to God, faith is strengthened. Another important principle is humility. Physical acts remind the believer that dependence on God is necessary. They acknowledge that outcomes are not controlled by human strength alone. This posture of humility attracts grace. Grace flows where dependence is acknowledged. Physical actions are tools for engagement, not sources of power. They awaken awareness, encourage obedience, and strengthen focus. When done with understanding, they activate confidence and expectation. When faith is engaged intentionally, the heart becomes bold, prayer becomes specific, and trust deepens. This is how physical actions activate spiritual consciousness. They help the believer move from abstract belief to intentional alignment. And when alignment is established, faith becomes active, expectant, and effective, positioning the heart to recognize and receive what God is already releasing. The moment you understand that your home is an altar, your approach to daily life changes. An altar is not merely a place of prayer, it is a point of continual exchange. It is where influence is established, where authority is recognized, and where outcomes are shaped over time. Every altar speaks. It speaks through consistency, through what is honored, and through what is repeatedly presented there. Your home, whether you are aware of it or not, is constantly declaring something. An altar does not require candles or rituals to function. It functions by priority. What receives the most attention in your home becomes dominant. What is spoken often gains authority. What is tolerated gains permission. In this sense, many people unknowingly build altars to stress, fear, arguments, or distractions. These are not intentional decisions, but repeated allowances. Over time, these allowances begin to influence atmosphere, behavior, and outcomes. When a home is treated as an altar unto God, order begins to emerge naturally. Prayer is not forced, it becomes normal. Peace is not negotiated, it is protected. Values are not occasionally discussed, they are consistently modeled. This consistency is what gives an altar strength. Occasional spiritual activity cannot outweigh constant neglect, but small, regular acts of alignment can transform an environment gradually and permanently. An altar is also a place of remembrance. It reminds those within the space of who is honored there. When God is honored in a home, awareness of his presence increases. Decisions are made differently. Words are chosen carefully. Reactions become measured. This is not religious pressure, it is reverence. Reverence does not restrict life, it brings clarity and stability. Every altar attracts a response. When God is acknowledged, his presence responds. His presence brings order, wisdom, and peace. This does not mean challenges disappear, but it means they no longer dominate. Problems become manageable. Pressure becomes purposeful. The presence of God stabilizes what would otherwise collapse under stress. A home altar also establishes authority. Authority is not loud, it is consistent. When a household consistently aligns with divine principles, spiritual resistance weakens, confusion loses ground, patterns of failure are interrupted. This is not because the family is perfect, but because alignment has been established. Authority flows with. Order is honored. Another dimension of an altar is sacrifice. Sacrifice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is choosing patience over anger, prayer over distraction, peace over pride. These small sacrifices accumulate. Over time, they shape character and atmosphere. God responds to sacrifice not because he demands loss, but because sacrifice demonstrates trust. Trust invites involvement. Altars also influence future generations. Children learn more from atmosphere than instruction. When a home carries peace, consistency, and faith, it becomes a reference point. Even when they step into the world, they remember where stability was found. A godly altar leaves an imprint that outlives seasons and circumstances. It is important to understand that an altar must be maintained. Neglect weakens influence. This does not mean constant activity, but conscious stewardship. Awareness is maintenance. Gratitude is maintenance. Prayer is maintenance. When maintenance is present, decline is resisted. Recognizing your home as an altar restores responsibility without condemnation. It empowers rather than burdens. You realize that God is not distant from your daily life. He is present in ordinary moments. When the home is aligned, life flows with greater ease. When an altar is established in a home, it becomes a place of refuge, clarity, and strength. And from that place, everything connected to it begins to find stability, direction, and purpose. One of the most important truths to understand is that God responds to faith, not to rituals. Rituals without faith become empty movements, while faith without understanding can become fragile. Faith is a living posture of the heart, an inner conviction that God is present, willing, and involved. When faith is active, it creates alignment. When faith is absent, even sincere actions lose meaning. Many people confuse repetition with power. They assume that doing something many times automatically produces results. But repetition without belief does not move heaven. God is not impressed by activity. He responds to trust. Trust is what opens the heart to receive. It is what allows expectation to rise above doubt. When faith is present, prayer becomes communication, not performance. Rituals often become substitutes for a relationship when understanding is lacking. People begin to rely on external actions because internal confidence is weak. But God does not desire dependency on objects or methods. He desires connection. Faith is relational. It flows from knowing who God is, not from mastering procedures. When relationship is strong, actions become expressions rather than replacements. Faith also requires intention. Casual belief produces casual results. Intentional faith engages the will, the mind, and the spirit. It chooses to trust even when emotions fluctuate. It holds on to truth even when circumstances contradict it. This kind of faith is not loud or dramatic. It is steady and resilient. It does not panic under pressure because it is rooted in confidence, not fear. Another dimension of faith is obedience. Faith that does not obey remains incomplete. Obedience is faith in motion. It proves belief. When God gives instruction, obedience demonstrates trust in his wisdom. This does not mean understanding everything beforehand. It means trusting enough to act. Obedience aligns the heart with divine order, creating space for God's involvement. Rituals can be helpful when they serve faith, but dangerous when they replace it. The danger lies in shifting trust from God to the act itself. When people begin to believe the action guarantees results, disappointment follows. God remains sovereign. He is not controlled by methods. Faith honors his sovereignty while trusting his character. Faith also requires patience. Immediate results are not always the measure of effectiveness. Sometimes faith is working quietly beneath the surface. God often responds progressively, strengthening foundations before revealing outcomes. Ritual-driven expectations often demand instant proof, but faith-driven confidence trusts timing as well as outcome. A heart anchored in faith is flexible but firm. It adapts without compromising. It waits without weakening. It prays without anxiety. This kind of faith does not collapse when things take time. It understands that God's movement is purposeful, not rushed. Faith also transforms perspective. Instead of focusing on what is lacking, faith focuses on who is present. It shifts attention from problems to possibilities. This does not deny reality. It reinterprets it through trust. When faith leads, fear loses influence. When faith speaks, doubt quiets. God honors faith because faith acknowledges his nature. It declares that he is faithful, capable, and involved. Rituals may create structure, but faith creates connection. And connection is what invites God's active participation. When faith is restored to its rightful place, actions become meaningful again. Prayer becomes sincere. Obedience becomes joyful. Trust becomes natural. This is the foundation of spiritual progress. Faith that is alive, intentional, and anchored in relationship rather than routine. Peace, favor, and protection are not emotional experiences. They are spiritual realities that must be enforced. Many people assume that if something is meant to happen, it will happen automatically. But in the realm of the spirit, nothing of value is sustained by passivity. What God gives freely must often be guarded deliberately. Divine provision establishes potential. Spiritual enforcement secures continuity. Peace is one of the first indicators of divine order. When peace is absent, clarity diminishes. Decisions become rushed, reactions become sharp, and direction becomes blurred. Peace does not mean the absence of challenges. It means the presence of stability within them. This kind of peace must be protected. It is threatened not only by external pressures, but also by internal neglect. Unresolved tension, constant worry, and unchecked distractions slowly erode peace. Enforcement begins with awareness. When peace is recognized as valuable, it is defended intentionally. Favor operates similarly. Favor is not randomness, it is alignment. It positions people, opens doors, and creates opportunities that effort alone cannot secure. However, favor is sensitive to atmosphere. Disorder can mute it. Pride can distort it. Inconsistency can weaken its effect. Favor thrives where humility, gratitude, and obedience are practiced. Enforcing favor means staying aligned with the values that attract it. When alignment is maintained, favor continues to flow without strain. Protection is often misunderstood as exemption from trouble. True protection is preservation in the midst of exposure. It does not always prevent storms, but it prevents destruction. Protection functions through boundaries. Boundaries are established by choices. What is allowed, what is rejected, what is corrected. Spiritual protection is strengthened when boundaries are respected. Neglecting boundaries invites vulnerability. Enforcement requires responsibility. God provides authority, but authority must be exercised. Authority without action remains dormant. Prayer activates awareness. Consistency sustains results. When a believer becomes consistent, spiritual resistance weakens. Patterns of loss begin to break, not because circumstances change overnight, but because permission is withdrawn. Another important aspect of enforcement is language. Words enforce realities. What you declare repeatedly apes expectation and atmosphere. Speaking peace reinforces it. Speaking fear weakens it. Words are not neutral, they carry direction. When words align with truth, they strengthen spiritual structures. When they contradict truth, they undermine stability. Enforcement also involves discernment. Not every battle requires confrontation, but every situation requires awareness. Knowing when to pray, when to rest, when to speak, and when to remain silent is part of spiritual maturity. Discernment prevents unnecessary struggle and preserves energy for what truly matters. Favor, peace, and protection often operate quietly. They are noticed more in their absence than their presence. This is why gratitude matters. Gratitude reinforces awareness. It keeps the heart aligned and prevents entitlement. Entitlement weakens enforcement because it assumes continuity without responsibility. Another key dimension is persistence. Enforcement is not a one-time act. It is a lifestyle. Just as physical health requires consistent care, spiritual stability requires ongoing attention. Small, regular practices are more effective than occasional intensity. Stability is built through consistency, not extremes. When peace is enforced, confusion retreats. When favor is guarded, progress accelerates. When protection is maintained, fear loses authority. These realities do not depend on emotional highs. They depend on disciplined alignment. When God moves, he empowers responsibility. And when responsibility is embraced, divine realities are sustained. This is how peace remains, favor continues, and protection endures, not by chance, but by intentional spiritual enforcement. Everything you have heard points to one central truth: spiritual results are not accidental. God moves where understanding, faith, and responsibility come together. Nothing discussed is about superstition, fear, or empty practice. It is about awareness. It is about alignment. It is about recognizing that your life and your home are spiritual territories entrusted to your care. When you understand covenant, you stop living in anxiety. When you recognize atmospheres, you stop tolerating disorder. When you act in faith with understanding, passivity loses its grip. When your home becomes an altar, consistency replaces confusion. When faith takes precedence over ritual, relationship deepens. And when peace, favor, and protection are enforced, stability becomes normal. God is not distant from your daily life. He is present in ordinary moments, waiting for intentional alignment. He responds to faith that is steady, not dramatic, to obedience that is sincere, not pressured, to hearts that are conscious, not careless. What he establishes, he preserves, but stewardship determines longevity. This is a season to take responsibility without fear and authority without pride. A season to guard what God has given, to cultivate peace deliberately, and to expect his involvement confidently. When understanding is restored, faith becomes active. When faith becomes active, environments shift. And when environments shift, lives follow. Your home can carry peace. Your life can reflect favor. Your future can be secure, not by chance, not by force, but by alignment with divine order. This is how God moves.